This is the most horrifying case of child murder I have ever seen. A tragic story, an unimaginable crime, and a search for justice. How could something so horrific happen, and who is truly responsible? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking details of this heartbreaking case. What are your thoughts on this case? Should punishments for crimes like this be even harsher? Share your opinions in the comments. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries that reveal the darkest sides of humanity.
Reichland Ross Brown came into this world on a warm spring day in May 2020. His tiny hands curled into fists, his first cries filling the hospital room. A brand new life, full of possibility. But life is cruel sometimes. Not every child gets the start they deserve. His mother, Mackenzie Brown, loved him. No one ever doubted that. But love alone wasn't enough. She was struggling, homeless, battling addiction, fighting a war with her own mind that she wasn't winning. When child services stepped in, when they took Reichland from her arms, she didn't have the strength to fight back. And that's how he found himself with Samantha and Theo Adams, a couple who never planned on fostering, but found themselves falling in love with a tiny, wide-eyed boy with dimples and a love for bedtime stories. Reichland was just 13 months old when they brought him home. A baby, really. Still unsteady on his feet, still learning how to say words like milk and truck. And in that house, for nearly 3 years, he was safe, happy, loved. He learned to walk on their living room floor, tiny feet padding across the carpet as his foster parents cheered him on. He laughed every time he heard the words, "Grumpy Monkey," his favorite book. He could listen to it 100 times and still giggle when they got to the part about the monkey's big, grumpy frown. At night, he would snuggle into Samantha's arms, his tiny fingers tangled in her shirt, his body warm and soft and perfect as they watched his favorite movies. The Cars franchise was his obsession. He could name every character, every scene, every line before it even happened. And trucks? Oh, he loved trucks. He could spot a dump truck from a mile away, shouting, "Look! Look!" with that excited energy only a toddler could have. Dinosaurs, too. He could name them all. From T-Rex to Triceratops, rattling off facts like he was already studying to be a paleontologist. This was his home. Not legally, maybe, not biologically. But home isn't just about DNA. It's about who makes you laugh, who holds you when you cry, who tucks you in at night and whispers, "I love you," when you're too sleepy to whisper it back. And Samantha and Theo, they were his parents in every way that mattered. They weren't perfect. No one is. But they loved that boy with everything they had. And for a while, it was enough. But the world doesn't care about love. The system doesn't look at bedtime stories and tiny dinosaur t-shirts and say, "This is where he belongs." The system only sees paperwork, names on birth certificates, court orders. And one day when Reichland was 3 years old, that paperwork changed everything. Because somewhere, in another city, there was a man who had never raised him. A man who had never rocked him to sleep, never kissed his scraped knees, never heard him call out for comfort in the middle of the night. A man who had never been a father, but now suddenly wanted to be. His name was Joshua Emmons. And he was about to rip Reichland away from the only home he had ever known. But it started with a phone call. Summer 2023. Out of nowhere, Mackenzie Brown called Samantha and Theo. It had been years since they'd heard from her, years since she had lost custody of Reichland. And now, suddenly, she had news. She told them Joshua Emmons was Reichland's biological father, and he wanted custody. Samantha felt her stomach drop. Theo's hands tightened into fists. This couldn't be real. Joshua, the man who had never raised Reichland, the man who had never sent a birthday card, never called, never even asked about him? That man? Now, after all this time, he wanted to play father? But here's the part that makes this even worse. Joshua wasn't just some absent dad who finally decided to step up. He was dangerous. And this isn't speculation. This isn't just a gut feeling. This is documented, proven in the system. In 2019, he was left alone with a 3-year-old boy, a child who trusted him, who saw him as just another adult in his little world. And what did Joshua do? He beat him, not just once, repeatedly. When the mother came home, she found her son covered in deep bruises, his face, his arms, his back, even his stomach, his tiny body black and blue from the force of an adult man's hands. And if that wasn't enough, there were burns, cigarette burns. Just think about that for a second. The level of cruelty that takes, the level of rage, to press a burning cigarette against the bare skin of a child and listen to them scream. Joshua was arrested. He pleaded guilty. There was no trial, no question of whether he did it. He admitted it. And the punishment for permanently scarring a child? 10 months in jail. Not 10 years. 10 months. But here's the thing. The system knew about this. His criminal record wasn't sealed. It wasn't hidden. One background check, one search of public records, and they would have seen it. And that was the man they wanted to give custody of Reichland to? Samantha and Theo panicked. They did what any rational, loving parent would do. They hired a lawyer. They gathered evidence, dug up records, pulled every document they could find. They thought, no, they knew this was open and shut. But CPS didn't care. The system didn't care. They sat across from Samantha and Theo and said the words that would seal Reichland's fate. He's the biological father. He has rights. Never mind that he had never been in his son's life. Never mind that his history alone should have been enough to disqualify him from ever being near a child again. None of that mattered, because on paper he was the father. And that was enough. In September 2023, the first step of this nightmare began. Joshua was granted supervised visitation. Samantha and Theo clung to that word, supervised. Maybe that meant there was still some level of protection. Maybe that meant someone was watching, making sure Reichland was safe. But here's what actually happened. Joshua barely showed up. He canceled. He ghosted. He made excuse after excuse. And when he did show up, he was late, or distracted, or barely paying attention. This wasn't a father trying to bond with his child. This was a man playing the part, just enough to get what he wanted. And yet the system kept rewarding him. CPS made it easier for him. Since driving 35 minutes was apparently too difficult, they decided to move the visits to Joshua's home. And that was the beginning of the end. Because Samantha and Theo weren't allowed inside Joshua's home. They didn't see what was happening behind those walls. They didn't know. Didn't know that Joshua didn't just live alone with Reichland. He lived with his fiancée, her 5 daughters, and their 2 shared children, 8 children, in a chaotic, overcrowded house. But that wasn't even the worst part, because inside that house, behind closed doors, away from social workers and case files and courtrooms, Reichland's fate was being decided, and no one was stopping it. And so, December 2023, the inevitable began. It started as small things, changes in behavior. Reichland was a happy kid. Everyone who knew him said the same thing. He was the type of child who could turn a bad day around with a giggle. But now, that light was dimming. He was quieter when he came home from visits, less talkative, less playful. Then one night, after an overnight stay with Joshua, he climbed into the car, buckled his seatbelt, and just sat there. No smiles, no silly little stories about his day. He didn't say a word. Samantha leaned into the back seat and smiled at him. "Hey, buddy," she said. "How was your visit?" Nothing. Then she closed the door, and as soon as it latched shut, he burst into tears. Sobbing. Not the kind of cry where a kid scrapes their knee and needs a hug. This was different. This was fear. Through broken little words, he finally said it. "Daddy hit me." Samantha's hands clenched on the steering wheel. "Where?" she asked. "Everywhere." She could barely see the road through her own tears. The next day, she and Theo did what any loving parents would do. They recorded everything. They sat down with Reichland, let him talk in his own words. He was clear. He was specific. He told them exactly what happened. They took that recording straight to CPS. And do you know what they were told? Kids make things up. Like it was nothing. Like a 4-year-old would just invent a story about being beaten. Samantha and Theo argued. They pleaded. They begged. In CPS's response, Joshua denied it. So that was that. Case closed. Because apparently when a convicted child abuser says, "No, I didn't do it," that's enough. But in February 2024, this time it happened. It was over something so painfully innocent, it makes you sick. Reichland had an accident. He was newly potty trained, a 4-year-old, still learning, still figuring it out. But when Joshua saw it, he lost it. When Samantha picked him up, he sat in his car seat, silent again. But this time, his lip was trembling. She knew before he even said it. "Did something happen?" she asked. He nodded. "What did Daddy do?" A whisper this time. "He hit me." Samantha and Theo did everything they could. They reported it, again. And still, nothing changed. Child Services told them, there's no proof. And that's when it became painfully clear. There was never going to be proof. Because in this system, a child's words don't count as proof. Their tears, their fear, their desperate pleas not to go back. None of it mattered. So March was coming, and full custody was coming with it. The moment Samantha and Theo had been dreading was about to become real. Because despite everything, despite the bruises, despite the history, despite Reichland himself begging not to go back, the system had already made up its mind. It was over. March 26th, 2024. The day the system signed its final death warrant. The day a courtroom full of people, judges, caseworkers, so-called experts, looked at a convicted child abuser and said, "Yes, you deserve full custody." No second guessing, no hesitations, no acknowledgement of the months of warnings, the documented reports, the desperate pleas from a child who was running out of time. That day, Samantha and Theo lost all legal rights to Reichland. And Joshua, he won. He stood there, the biological father he had never been, and promised that Samantha and Theo could still visit, that he wouldn't keep them from Reichland, that they would still be in his life. He was lying. They never saw him again. 2 months later was Reichland's 4th birthday, the first one he would spend away from them. So she did what any mother would do. She reached out. She texted Joshua, begged him, just a few minutes, just a phone call, just let them hear his voice. Nothing. No reply. No update. No response. She checked her phone all day. Nothing. Then on May 26th, 2024, at about 11 p.m., 911 operators picked up a call from Joshua's home. His voice was frantic, rushed, rehearsed. He told them his son had fallen. A terrible accident. He said Reichland tumbled down the stairs. But let's be real here. 4-year-olds don't just fall downstairs and end up in the hospital fighting for their life. That's not how this works. That's never how this works. The paramedics arrived, and what they saw was not an accident. Reichland was barely clinging to life. His injuries were severe, far too severe for a simple fall, and yet Joshua stuck to his story. He fell. That's all he would say. But the doctors knew better. They had seen this before. They rushed Reichland to upstate Golisano Children's Hospital. For 3 days, he lay in that hospital bed. Then on May 29th, 2024, the machines beeped slower. The nurses whispered. And then finally, the monitors flatlined. 4 years old, gone. Just like that. They did an autopsy because of course they did, because they had to know. Not that it was ever in question. The autopsy results showed that it was a blunt force trauma to the head and not a fall. And the worst part, the bruises all over his body. Because that's what happens when a child is being abused for weeks, months before the final blow is ever struck. And yet, Joshua remained free, but Samantha and Theo weren't free though. They were trapped in grief, suffocating in it, because they had fought so hard. They had done everything right. And still, the system had handed their little boy over to a monster. And now he was gone. The investigation dragged on. For months, Joshua walked free. Because the system was slow, because the system didn't want to admit it had screwed up on a level so catastrophic, it ended in a life stolen. But then, July 30th, 2024. The police finally came for him. And where did they find him? Hiding, under the basement stairs, covered in a blanket. They dragged him out. They cuffed him. And this time there was no escape. But here's the thing. This wasn't justice, because justice would have been stopping this before it ever happened. Justice would have been Reichland blowing out candles on his 4th birthday. Justice would have been listening to a child who begged for help before it was too late. But nobody listened. And now, a little boy is buried in the ground because the people meant to protect him let him die. And so the charges came. Second-degree charges. The man who had spent 4 years ignoring his son, then 2 months destroying him, now sat behind bars, waiting for a trial. But let's be honest, no sentence, no courtroom verdict, no amount of prison time will ever be enough. Because the real damage, it's already done. And then there was Mackenzie Brown, the mother who had lost custody long ago, the mother who had tried to claw her way back. After Reichland's death, she finally spoke. And her words, they cut deep. "I did everything," she said. "I got clean. I got a job. I got a place to live. I did everything they told me to do, but they still wouldn't give him back to me." She had tried. She followed their rules, checked every box, and still they wouldn't return her son. But Joshua didn't have to prove a thing. No parenting classes, no drug tests, no monitored home visits. He asked for custody, and they just handed Reichland over. Even with a criminal record, even with a history of violence, because once again, he was the biological father, and in the eyes of the system, that was enough. In the days after his death, Samantha did the only thing she could do. She kept his memory alive. She posted his pictures, his videos, his bedtime giggles. She wanted people to remember him not as the bruised child in a hospital bed, but as the little boy who loved dinosaurs and bedtime stories. And when people asked what they could do, how they could help, her answer was simple. If you have kids, read them an extra bedtime story tonight. Hold them a little tighter, because I would give anything to do that again. Because that's what was stolen from them. Not just a child, not just a life, but the small moments, the hugs, the bedtime snuggles, the whispered "I love yous," the things that should have lasted for years and years. So now, all that's left is the truth. Reichland Ross Brown cried for help. He begged for someone to listen, but the world ignored him. And now, a little boy who loved dinosaurs, bedtime stories, and snuggling on the couch is gone. What do you think about this case? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. But there's a case that left even the most experienced investigators stunned for years. A case so complex, it stayed unsolved for over 50 years. We can't reveal all the details here, but with the religious complexities and polarities involved, there's much more to uncover. In fact, if you've watched our previous videos, you might have noticed we toned down the true gravity of the Cameri case for compliance reasons. However, our loyal followers turned members will get exclusive access to the full, untold story. We're working on something special for you, and this case is just the start. Click the link in the description to join us and get the full picture.